Morning, Rabbi.
Good morning. Okay, Chevra, vamos. With the help of Hashem, we are learning PESACHIM Daf Mem Zayin. We began on Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph from the bottom of the Amud with the Mishnah. We have a two-way machlokes Tanoim. Really, the Mishnah has three Tanoim, but we're going to focus on Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. We're speaking about someone who's baking a dough on Pesach, on Yom Tiv, and the dough is tummy. And the challenge is that when will you separate the challah? And as we explained, that challah, that's tameh, we all know, may not be consumed. Baking on Yom Tiv is only allowed if it's l'tzoyrech Yom Tiv. Since you cannot eat it, you can't bake it. Well, leaving it be, well, you leave dough alone, it becomes chametz. So what should you do? So Rabbi Eliezer says, bake all of the dough, even though you're baking some of it, challah. We'll explain more in the next daf why that's not an issue with Rabbi Eliezer, the different ways of understanding it. The point of Rabbi Eliezer here in the beginning of the sugya is that the owner of the dough owns it enough for him to be chayiv if it will become chametz. So you have to bake it, and only after you bake it, they are all gathered in a basket, and then yes, you separate the already baked, meaning non-challah, non-chametz part of it for the kohen. The kohen cannot eat it, the kohen can burn it, can have hana from it. That's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yeshua holds no. Rabbi Yeshua disagrees that you are allowed to bake all of it on Yom Tiv because some of it will become challah. Challah may not be baked on Yom Tiv. On the other hand, Rabbi Yeshua has no issue with you just leaving it be, and yes, and it probably will become chametz. So what? It's not yours. Neither is it any specific kohen's. That was the Mishnah, machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. The first approach in the Gemara is that they are arguing whether toivas hana gives you equity in it or not. The Gemara then said maybe not, and we'll explain this again more in Daf Mem Ches. We'll come back to all of it. It's not about toivas hana, but it's about the principle of hoyel. What's the principle of hoyel? Since even after you render it into challah, challah, like truma, like a neder, is something that could be retroactively undone. So therefore, it's considered yours. And the Gemara and Daf Mem Vav was not focusing on what about baking it on Yom Tov. If you're baking something on Yom Tov that cannot be consumed, that will be later on Daf Mem Ches, even though we spoke it out when we learned the Gemara. But the question is it yours or not? Rabbi Eliezer holds it's yours. Why does he hold it's yours? Because even though you designated it as challah, it could be undone. And hoyel, since you could undo it, it's already considered yours for you to be over, which is why you have a problem, which is why the solution of Rabbi Eliezer is to bake all of it before you separate challah. So once we mentioned the insight into Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua is about hoyel or not, from there we went into a machlokes amoyroim. The linkage of it will happen on Daf Mem Ches. The machlokes is between Rabbi and Abchizda, and they are discussing whether a person who bakes something on Yom Tiv for the weekday is going to get malchus or not. Now, l'chora, you should be getting malchus because again, even though oichel nefesh is something that is permitted to be done on Yom Tiv, and not only that, but that's only for Yom Tiv. If you're baking something on Yom Tiv for the weekday, you're going to be chayiv malchus l'chora. However, Rabbi holds that since if guests were to come today, even though you don't plan to eat it, they would eat it. And therefore it would become tzorech Yom Tov, even though you don't know of such guests, but hoyel, you're not chayiv malchus. Rabbi subscribes to hoyel. Rabbi Chizda holds, no, we don't subscribe to hoyel. If you bake on Yom Tov for the weekday, you're chayiv malchus. Problem then became, how does Eidov Tafshilin work? In other words, Eidov Tafshilin, which is baking on Yom Tov for Shabbos, by you making the Eidov Tafshilin and beginning the baking and the cooking before Yom Tov, only works if the problem to begin with is only a midrabanan. So the Eidov Tafshilin will permit it because the Chachamim said that you began before, and they allow that to work. If you have an Isur D'Oraisa, that's the premise. Eidov Tafshilin will not make something that's Asur Midoraisa mutter to be done. So Bishleim el Rabba, baking from Yom Tov to Shabbos is something again that Midoraisa is permitted because hoyel guests might come on Yom Tov itself. It's takosan midrabanan. But if you make an erev tafshilin, it becomes mutter. According to Rabbi Chisda, who rejects the principle of hayol, then how does erev tafshilin work? So now that's where we're up to right now. So it must be that this now will become a new machlokas between Rabbi and Rabbi Chisda, and that is that Rabbi Chisda will hold that even though you may not bake or cook miyam tov l'choil, but mido oiraisa you are allowed to bake and cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos, because since both are holy days, so it's considered one unit of holy days. It's not miyam tov l'choil; it's miyam tov to its sister holy day. Mido oiraisa it's permitted. It's only Yasser Midrabanan. Again, for Isur Drabanan, you have now the heter of the Erev Tafshilin. The Chachamim are allowed to figure out a way how to overdo their own Isur Midrabanan. So now we're up to a Machlekes Rabbi and Rabbi Chisda, whether cooking from Yom Tov to Shabbos is an Isur D'Oraisa, which is the sheet of Rabbi without hoil, but conceptually. And according to Rabbi Chisda, Midoraisa, Tzarchi Shabbos are allowed to be done on Yom Tov. We're going to now challenge the sheet of Rabbi Chisda, excuse me, from two Mishnayos that we have in Masechta Menachos. One is about the baking of the lechem apanim. One is about the baking of the shtei halechem. But we will not refute Shitas Rabbi Chisda. Not only that, the Gemara on Daf Mem Zayin is going to go more. It's going to go back to the original machlokes between Abba and Rabbi Chisda, whether we subscribe to Hoyel or not. We're going to be quoting one case where a person plows, and the one act of plowing will bring about 8 lavin violations. The person is going to get malchus 8 times over. That's a din that we're going to learn in Masechta Makos. We're going to see how this correlates to the hoyel. We're going to learn a little bit about the mitzvah, the obligation of covering the blood of a oif and or of a chaya. We're going to have then on Daf Amud Beis a scenario where a person, God forbid, cooked gid hanasha in milk on Yom Tov, for which you're going to be chayiv 5 sets of malchus, and all of that will lead back into the sugya of hoyel. Do we subscribe to hoyel or not? And at the end of today's daf, we're going to learn about what's called hachana derabba. Hachana derabba means that if a person had something excluded from use before Shabbos or before Yom Tov, and then on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, not only do they move it, moving muktzas midrabanan, but they use it, Rabbi holds that is a biblical violation, and all of that will be used in farenfening, in trying to work out and not allowing any Tana in a Mishnah or in a Braisa refute not Shitas Rabba nor Shitas Rab Chisda, whether we subscribe to Hoyel or not. So let's start on Daf Mem Vav Amud Beis at the end in the last line. But again, we're not focusing now on Hoyel. Because of the issue with Hoyel and Eruv Tafshilin, the Gemara introduced that Rab Chisda must hold that Midoy Raisa, Tzarchi Shabbos could be done on Yom Tov, which is how Eruv Tafshilin works, even Rab Chisda that does not subscribe to Hoyel. So this kasha, Eisveg, in the end of the Amid is a kasha on that sheet of Rab Chisda. How can you say that Midoy Raisa, one is allowed to do things for Shabbos on Yom Tov? We have a Mishnah Menachos, lechem apanim, now the lechem apanim, which was consumed on Shabbos, but as we remember, we did not bake it, not on the day that it was consumed, not even the day prior. The lechem apanim would first sit on the shulchan for an entire week. It was actually placed, the new ones were placed, and the old ones were removed in middle of Shabbos, and only a week later, when the yet new ones were placed and the old ones removed, it was then that the lechem apanim was divided. We'll learn more details about this between the Mishmar HaNichnas, between the Mishmar HaYotze, and the Kohen Gadol has his rights to it, v'chulei, but it was consumed a week after it was placed. But one second, when was it baked? It was not baked on Shabbos. It was baked prior to Shabbos. So says the Mishnah, top of the Amud Daf Mem Zayin, that the lechem apanim sometimes nechal l'tisha was eaten after 9 days from it being baked. Now, just guys, not to get confused, we are including the day of the baking. And just speak out this part, very simple. You know, by a bris is on the 8th day. But Baruch Hashem, those of us who had sons, we remember if a baby is born on Sunday, the bris is on Sunday. Monday, that's the 8th day. So if it's placed on Shabbos and it's removed the next Shabbos, but it was baked Erev Shabbos, so from Erev Shabbos to the next Shabbos, that's 9 days. That's the normal. and including the day that it was baked, including the day that it's consumed, you have 9 days from when it was baked until when it was consumed. And by the way, one of the miracles that happened is that not only was it fresh, but it was smoking fresh. As during the Regalim, if you remember, that the Kahanim had the permission and they did it, they brought it out in an area where the Yisraelim were able to see how there was smoke coming out of the Lechem Apanim. And that was even if it was already the 9th day. That's how great the miracle was. But the Mishnah continues. Sometimes la'asar, it was only eaten on the 10th day, and sometimes la'achad 11 days. And the Mishnah then says, right, leipachus v'lo yoser. We have a whole series of Mishnahs using this formulation. Leipachus means it was never consumed before 9 days, and it was never consumed beyond the 11 days. And the Mishnah says, Ketzad kid darkoi, like we mentioned, Latisha. In other words, explains the Mishnah that it's baked the Erev Shabbos. It's not baked on Shabbos. It's baked Erev Shabbos. And when is it eaten? The next Shabbos. Friday to the next Shabbos is 9 days. There's Nechel b'Shabbos, which is Latisha. Now, what happens if Yom Tov falls out on Erev Shabbos and we may not bake from Yom Tov to Shabbos? We're eating it on Shabbos. I know next week. So therefore, you don't bake it on Yom Tov. When would you bake it? The day prior to Yom Tov, if it's a normal 1 day Yom Tov, which is the biblical normal time of Yom Tov. So then instead of baking it on Friday, you bake it on Thursday. Oh, so that's 10 days. So then Nechel Shabbos, which is La'asara. And in the case, Shnei Yomim Klevim Shol Rosh Hashanah, what happens if Rosh Hashanah is Thursday, Friday? So then when are you going to bake it again? Erev Yom Tov. When is Erev Yom Tov? Wednesday. From Wednesday to Shabbos is 11 days. Is Nechel Shabbos la'achad asar. Now, before we come back to Rabbi Chisda, before we come back to this issue of Midai Raisa, whether you can bake on Yom Tov for Shabbos, hold on. Guys, we have Rosh Hashanah Thursday, Friday. This is something that can happen in today's fixed calendar. When will Yom Kippur be? When Rosh Hashanah is Thursday, Friday, when is Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is Shabbos. Shabbos you're not allowed to eat. What are we talking about? That they ate the lechem upon him 11 days later. They would eat the lechem upon him 12 days later. You can't eat on Yom Kippur. Look inside Tosis. Keep your finger here by the aleph of the A Mishpat and the Gemara. This is mamish beautiful. The top Tosis. Nechol achad asa yom kigoin. So let's chazer the rules. We're just going to have this for those of us who learn Perek Echad Yom in Kiddush HaChodesh and the Rambam. When Eidim come after the Zman of Mincha on Thursday, since they already brought the Talmud Shalbeinu Arbayim, because there was one time that they were waiting and they didn't know what to bring the Talmud Shalbeinu Arbayim, to bring the Musav of Yantiv, and there was a terrible thing that happened. They didn't bring the Talmud. So once the time of Mincha comes, which is 3:30 p.m. approximately, they bring the Korban. A Korban of Talmud means it ends the weekday, and then witnesses come. That will be the case where even in the Beis HaMikdash there's going to be 2 days Yantiv of Rosh Hashanah. Guys, let's remember this. When you speak today about 2 days Rosh Chodesh, it's amazing. That didn't exist in those days, 2 days Rosh Chodesh. And 2 days Rosh Chodesh today is the first day is Lamed. The second day is Aleph. What's the big exception today? Rosh Hashanah. When we have 2 days Rosh Chodesh, 2 days Rosh Hashanah, the first day Rosh Hashanah is not Lamed Elul. There's no Lamed. It's Echad B'Tishrei. So Tosfos is reminding us or teaching us for the first time that in the Beis HaMikdash, there were times that there were 2 days Rosh Hashanah when the Eidim came after they brought the Korban Talmud Shalbeinu Arbayim Min Amin Chol Hamayla. But you know what? That day was not Yom Aleph. That's important. In the Beis HaMikdash, when the Eidim came late, what we would call on the first day, and they already closed the first day in the Beis HaMikdash as a Yom Choil. And when Eidim came and they said that today was really Rosh Hashanah, they were noyeg that day Kodesh and the next day Kodesh. But you know what? That day was not counted as Yom Echad. It was counted as Yom Lamed. Very similar to today's first day Rosh Chodesh. So therefore, the Aleph Tishrei would be when? Would be on Friday. If Aleph of Tishrei is Friday, when is Yom Kippur? Gavaldik, on Sunday. So it works. Now they would bake it prior. They would make it prior because they didn't know whether Eidim will come on Thursday or not. They won't know that. So whenever there's a possibility for Rosh Hashanah to fall out Thursday, Friday, they would bake the Lachem upon him on Wednesday. Gavaldik. Because if the Eidim were to come before Mincha, then what would Thursday be? Then Thursday would be Aleph, and Friday would be a weekday. However, since if Edom would come in a mincha l'mayla, both Thursday and Friday would be, then we would have to behave like it is a Yom Tov. Indeed, it would be 2 days Rosh Hashanah, so they would bake it on Wednesday. But even if that were to happen, we don't have a problem. Even if that were to happen, that they would come in a mincha l'mayla, then Shabbos would be Tes. Now, hold on. What happens if the witnesses came before mincha? And we're right that we have a problem. So you bake bread on Wednesday. But that bread cannot be eaten 11 days later, because then Taka Shabbos, the next Shabbos would be Yud, if the Edom come earlier. So Tosfos says that they would bake bread again on Friday, because when the Edom came in the Beis Hamikdash prior to Mincha, and Thursday would be Echad prior to Mincha, then the next day would be Beis Tishrei. Beis Tishrei might be Tzom Gedalim. There's a whole machlokes about that. Maybe some Gedalia Taka happened on Rosh Hashanah. We delayed the fast. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that it was not by a shady mistama. They didn't fast on Tzom Gedalia because the Beis Hamikdash was rebuilt. Anyways, Friday is not a Yom Tov, and then they would bake bread again on Friday. What would they do with the first breads? So Tosfos is of the sheet over here that they can redeem it, because it was not imbued with Kedushas Haguf, because the Tanurim don't have a din of a Klei Shabbos. This is a very important Tosfos. Okay, coming back in the Gemara. Bottom line is, look at the Aleph and the Amish, but Ner Mitzvah Lefisha Ein Doichaleis HaShabbos V'Loyes HaYom Tov, which is why it always has to be baked prior. End of Mishnah. Now says the Gemara V'i Amrat Tzorchei Shabbos Nasim B'Yom Tov on a biblical level, which is the sheet of Rab Chizda. Amai Loidochi Yom Tov. Hold on. Then the only issue is the issue that Rabbanan. In all the cases, in the case where Friday is Yom Tov, why don't you bake on Friday? Now, guys, one thing is clear. Even Rab Chizda, who holds that Mido Oiraisa, you are allowed to bake Mi Yom Tov L'Shabbos, that's only Mido Oiraisa, but it's also Mido Rabbanan. Well, how did we end the whole Masechta of Eruvin? For those of us who can't wait to get back to that, ain't Shvus B'Mikdash. So in the Beis Hamikdash, there's no Shvus. So why would we have to B'chlal go to 10 days? Let it be the 9 days. When Yom Tov falls out, bake it on Yom Tov for Shabbos. Ain't Shvus B'Mikdash. Now, according to Rabbi, there's no kasha. According to Rabbi, baking Yom Tov for Shabbos is an Isur Doiraisa. So answers the Gemara, this is about Shvus B'Mikdash. That Amar Lei, that Rab Chizda responds, I know ain't Shvus B'Mikdash, but Shvus means Shvus Keroiva Hitiru. When something is being done for a immediate purpose, for a need that's for now. Shvus Rechaika, baking bread on Friday Yom Tov. For next Shabbos, for 9 days later, Lo Hitiru. No, it's eventually there'll be a need. Then they did not open up the Shvus. As Bechlal we learned in the end of Eruvin, that it's not a hard and fast rule, ain't Shvus B'Mikdash Nekuda. Nishtemes. There are many cases where there is a Shvus B'Mikdash. Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, the Amar in the name of Rab Shimon Asgan, that holds that the baking of the Lechem Panim does override Yom Tov. He argues with the whole Tanakh and Menachos. He holds that the only day that the baking of the Lechem Panim does not override is Yom Kippur. In other words, if Yom Kippur falls out on Friday, then you can't bake it on Friday. You have to break it on the day prior. Doiches Yom Tov. Doiches Yom Tov. Doiches Yom Tzayim. So my Ikal Meimer, in other words, he holds that you did bake it on Yom Tov. And by the way, that would fit with him holding that Midoy Raisa, Tzorchei Shabbos could be done on Yom Tov. But if you're telling me that Tzorchei Shabbos are allowed to be done on Yom Tov is only Midoy Raisa, L'kula Alma Tzasam Midrabanan, how can it be mated it? The answer must be ain't Shvus B'Mikdash. But if you're telling me that Shvus Rechaika is not a heter, so how do you explain the Shita of the Rashbag? So Rab Chizda will tell you this must be their machlokes. Indeed, Bahapligi, notice that's a machlokes Tanoim lit Rab Chizda whether we're matir Marsa the Tanakama holds Shvus Kereva Hitiru, but Shvus Rechaika Lo Hitiru, and that is the whole argument of the Rashbag. The Rashbag holds that Shvus Rechaika Nami Hitiru, and the only exception would be on Yom Kippur. Yavaldik, which even, in other words, on Yom Tov you can bake. Let's just explain why Yom Kippur is different. On Yom Tov you can bake. The problem of Yom Tov baking is if you're not baking it for the day of Yom Tov itself. But baking on Yom Tov for Yom Tov is mutter, tzarich reichel nefesh. That heter you don't have on Yom Kippur. That's why L'Kula Alma on Yom Kippur, it's Asun Midoraisa to bake, period. Okay, next. Masav Rav Mari, another challenge on Rab Chizda. What Rab Chizda? The Rab Chizda that holds that Midoraisa, Tzarchi Yom Tov could be done on, Tzarchi Shabbos could be done on Yom Tov. Weiter Mishnah Menachis. They were speaking about the baking of the Shtei HaLechem that was waved and then consumed when we would shech the Shalmei Tzibur, which are the karbanos that are brought on Shavuos. So the Shtei HaLechem, a similar formulation in the Mishnah, Einam Nechalois, they will never be eaten. Loi Pachus Mishnayim, there's always going to be at least 2 days, the day of the baking, and of Shavuos, and they're going to be baked, they're going to be consumed the next day on Shavuos, which is 2 days, and sometimes 3 days, but never more than 3 days. Lepachas mishnayim, v'lo yoyser al shloisha, keitzad baruch ato adinoi, leinu malachenu shakolim dvarim. Says the Mishnah, ne'efois erev Yom Tov, when they're normally baked on erev Yom Tov, erev Shavuos, nechalas liyom tov, then it's eaten the next day, which means lishnayim, on its second day. However, chal Yom Tov liyas achar HaShabbos, but what happens if Shavuos is 1 day in the Beis HaMikdash, and that is Yisrael? If the 1 day Shavuos is on Sunday, can't bake on Shabbos, so therefore they were baked on Erev Shabbos, so then the chal is liyom tov lishloisha. And as the Mishnah concludes, using more the same lashon, that lefi she'enoi doicha lo yasa Shabbos v'lo yasa Yom Tov. Now asks the Gemara on Rab Chizda, v'i amrat tzarchi Shabbos, could be done on Yom Tov. So oy bazoi hashta the Shabbos be Yom Tov shari. So for you to do something on Yom Tov for that same day is the Chavada permitted. And therefore, what's the question? Why did we Bechlal have to bake a day prior? Why could you not bake? Why could you not bake on Shavuos? Oh, now the question is, before we go into the Gemara, why isn't this a kasha on Rabba? Chevra? Okay, I know that Rabba holds that biblically you cannot cook or bake from Yom Tov to Shabbos. But this question of why can't you bake the loaves that will be eaten on that day, on the same day, that's a kasha on everyone. So look inside the Rashi, 1, 2, 3, 4, under the Gemara, B'Yom Tov miboyeh, says Rashi, that even though you can't eat it right after you baked it, why not? Because after you bake it, you have to shech the animal, you have to sprinkle the dam. Nevertheless, so chazil boy bayoy. And therefore, why would this be worse from preparing things on Yom Tov for the next day Shabbos? Listen to these words. Wow. We hold that Rabbi says that if you bake on that if you bake on Yom Tov for Shabbos, we apply hoil. Yeah, because if you apply hoil after you baked, if Orchim will come, you will immediately be able to serve it to them. In other words, explains Rashi, that according to everyone, theoretically, when did God allow us to prepare food for Yom Tov? When? If you can eat it right after you prepare it. Right after you prepare it. And guys, how many times do we even have in Masechta Shabbos this concept about doing certain things on Shabbos that only is allowed to be done right before the meal? Same concept even on Yom Tov. The Torah is matter a lot more on Yom Tov. But we're going with the premise that when can you cook and bake? If you can eat it immediately. Now, the truth be told, if you're not going to eat it immediately, if you subscribe to Hoyel, which is Rabba, since the moment it's ready, if Orchim will come, they can eat it right away. That's why you are allowed to do it. Let's not forget that Rab Chizda rejects Hoyel. Now, Rab Chizda, who holds that you can bake from one day to the next, from Yom Tov to Shabbos, so he does not subscribe to the need of consuming it immediately. So only on Rab Chizda we have a kasha. Why can't you bake the lechem up, the shtei lechem, on that day of Shavuos? According to Rabbi, I'll tell you the answer. Because when you bake it, you can't eat it right after you baked it. You can't. Because even if they not do it Orchim, this is part of Kachim. You have to now shech, then do the Zrika. Then you have to be makted the emurim. In other words, there are many steps that need to happen before you're going to consume the bread, which is why you can't eat it. But according to Rabbi Chizda, he certainly does not hold of the immediately, because he holds you can do tzarchi Shabbos on Yom Tov. So why did you have to bake the bread, the shtei alechem a day prior in the Gemara?
Rabbi, can you just clarify that? Meaning for us, we bake bread if we wanted to on Yom Tov morning to eat it in Yom Tov afternoon. That's not a problem. So what's this concept that you have to be able to eat it immediately, and only then
we subscribe to Hoyle. And therefore, since right after you baked it, theoretically, it could be consumed. And if a need comes up for it to be consumed immediately, it will be consumed immediately. So that's why it's permitted, even though you're doing it for the morning, in the morning for the afternoon. Gewaldig.
But if for some reason there was a break that you absolutely could not,
the case will be this case. This will be the case that in the Beis Hamikdash you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov. You're allowed to bake on Yom Tov. They did not bake the shtei alechem. Why not bake it on Yom Tov? Because since you have to wait until a later step in the offering happens, it will never be eaten immediately. You have to bake it a day prior. That's all the Rabbi. Rabbi subscribes to that, but not Rabbi Chizda answers the Gemara Shani Hassan. The Amar Kra Lochem. Bachlal. Forget about the immediately and later. How do you know that you are allowed to bake and cook on Yom Tov? You're violating many malachas. The answer is the Torah says, Ach asher ye'achel l'chol nefesh, right? Hulavade ye'yaseh lochem. Lochem. If you're doing something not for you, now Kahanim eat, but Kahanim are eating mishulchan gavoya. It's God's carbon. There's no heter b'chlal. Lochem eloy legavoya. Like we learned before in the Lechem Apanim, that yes, doiches hayamtiv. How can it be doicha yantiv? Hold on, it says lochem. How can he allow you to bake it on yantiv, the lechem upon him? So it must be that he doesn't interpret the lochem that way. Savar loka abashol that learns lochem lochem. And by the way, the other shitas will learn both from the lochem. This lochem l'nachrim is halacha l'maisa. The reason why it says in Shulchan Aruch not to have goyim around your table on yantiv is because of this halacha. Many people think it's connected to Pesach. It has nothing to do with goyim by a seder. It says in Shulchan Aruch that you can have goyim on your table for Shabbos. You can't have goyim around your table on Yontiv, because if you will violate malachas for that meal, which you are allowed to do, only lochem. And parenthetically, if a person, like today in America, thank God there's so much wealth and there's so much abundance, and people, Baruch Hashem, have large families, and whether you're going to have one guest more, one guest less, or for many people, 5 guests more, 5 guests less, it makes no difference in your food preparation. Then your taka can have an anju around your table because you're not preparing anything especially for them. Anyways, it's already prepared. Okay, back over here. Says the Gemara Sholach Lei Rav Chizda Rabbi. But he didn't communicate directly. This was something that he communicated biyad through Rav Acha bar Rav Huna. And now we're going back to Hoyel. Now we put aside the midoraisa preparing Yom Tov for Shabbos. Let's go back to the Hoyel. The machlekes is Rabba subscribes to Hoyel. Rav Chizda rejects the Hoyel principle. So he asked him, how can you subscribe to Hoyel? These are gewaldige Mishnayos, and it says in Makis that yesh chodesh telam echad. There's a scenario where a person is going to plow one single furrow. He's going to make one act of chadisha, and you know what? And he's going to be chayiv for it. Second to last line, 8 malkasim, shmoin alaven for one single act. And what will be the case? Says the Mishnah, chodesh b'shor v'chamoy. First of all, what animals is he using? An ox and a donkey. That's an explicit pasuk in the Torah, not to plow with an ox and a donkey. So that's lav number 1. Number 2, happened to be that they're both mugdashim. Whoa, chamayr mugdash. Chamayr is like a behemoth tameya. Says Rashi Pseder that the shoyer could be a case where you taka were magdish the shoyer for the mizbeach kedusha saguf, and the chamayr, like anything else, you can donate it to the bedek habayis. But using something that belongs to the bedek habayis, which is what we call me'ila b'mezid, we just had the sugya, this Tana holds that you're violating a lav, to take something purposefully and using it for yourself. So we're up to 3 lavin, because you violated l'sachar shoy b'chamor yachtov, and then you used both the shoy and the chamoid. For each animal, you're going to chop another set of malchus. That's number 3. What were you plowing? It's one furrow. You were plowing kilei akarim, which means that someone put a kernel of wheat, a kernel of barley, and the grapeseed. And now with that furrow, you're turning earth over it. That's mamish kalayim. So that's number 4, turning to daf mem zayin amid base. And then it happened to be on the year of Shemitah. And like Rashi points out, even though the Torah says explicitly, Sodcha loy sizra, but Charisha and Zeriya are connected. So you're going to be chayiv, number 5. And it was on Yom Tov, plowing on Yom Tov. Now, guys, yeah, there is a heter l'tzorech choichel nefesh to prepare food on Yom Tov, for Yom Tov, only if preparing it on Yom Tov will make the food fresher, like baking bread. I know that I can eat bread that's baked yesterday or 2 days ago, but it's better if it's baked today. When it comes to plowing, to planting, even to harvesting, makes no difference. It makes no difference whether it was done today or yesterday in those cases. And that's why it may not be done on Yom Tov. So we're up to 6 lavin. And now this lav is not directly connected to the maisa of plowing, but it's connected to the location. And that is that who was doing the plowing? He was a kohen. On top of that, he was a nazir, both of which are not allowed to be matama themselves to corpse tuma, and they were plowing it abeis hatuma, meaning in a cemetery. Okay, Gavaldi. So here you found a scenario, a quiz. How can you do one act of plowing and you can be chayiv 8 malchus? And here's your case. This kasha is against Rabbi. You subscribe to Hoyel. You should not be chayiv for plowing. Why not? If you were to shech the bird, if you shech the chaya, now shechting a chaya is not that common, but it's the same kasha. Shechting a bird is very common. Guys, they would shecht on Yom Tov. And there's an obligation to cover the dam be'ofar. And if a person does not have ofar, even though really don't shecht, but if you already shechted, so then if you're gonna do an act to get the earth to cover it, the Gemara is arguing that should not be a lav. You're not violating for charisha because it's part of your mitzvah of covering the dam. Gevaldik. So you have to take 1 lav off. So Rabbi, it's amazing. The Rabbi is going to agree that theoretically Hoyel should exempt you from the act of charisha because you can always explain it that you might need that dirt. It must be that you only chayv the 8 malchus in a scenario where the dirt that you're going to be getting from the act of charisha won't be ra'ui to do kisui dam. So Amar Rav Papa Bar Shmuel, it must be that you did this act of charisha in a location where the earth is filled with avanim mikurzalos. I know we learned avanim mikurzalos in another context that normally avanim are muksa on Shabbos, but because of human dignity, right? So they allow you to use avanim mikurzalos. They used to wipe themselves. That's not over here. It's especially the stones are round or they're sharp, but they're stones that even when you bring them up through charisha, they're not valid for kisui dam, which has to be done with something soft and dry. But the Gemara is still not happy. The Gemara is going to go further. You know what? Because of Hoyel, you should be allowed to do charisha. And even though as it is, it's very hard stones, but you would be able, you are able to crush them. And if you were to crush these avanim mikurzalis, then they would be fit for kisui dam. So the Gemara counters, no. That ktisha, b'yamtev, mishari, the crushing is a tool of teichen, is a tool of grinding. And that's something that will never be permitted. Hold on a second. Why not? If you are allowing charisha for kisui dam, then why can't you do ketisha for kisui adam? You can't. You can't do an act of charisha that's not even going to give you something that's ro'ui. It's too far away. You're going to do charisha, and then you're going to have to do katisha. That's not something that will justify. Says the Gemara, I still have a kasha, that even though you are getting avanim mikurzalos and you're not allowed to do an act of grinding on Yom Tov, but as we learned in Shabbos, that all of the malachas midai raisa are only if one does it kedarka. The moment you do any act of a malacha, you bring it down from a deraisa into a derabanan, and God forbid, we're not minimizing isuri derabanan, but we are challenging the Mishnah that speaks about 8 sets of Malchus. Malchus you only get for Isur Doiraisa. Ru'uyos lekotchen kela'achar yad. And that would taka be Asur Midrabanan, but at least it won't be a set of Malchus. And if you subscribe to oil, you should not be chayv that 8th set. So again, we have to limit the scenario only b'tzumma, which is that we're speaking about a case where it's muddy. And since it's muddy, Sunma means, what's mean Sunma? Sunma means it's very rocky. It's very rocky, meaning that it cannot be ground. It's some sort of earth that cannot be ground. It's never going to be fit for Kisei Adam. And now the Gemara has a counter. How can you say that this Mishnah is speaking about B'tzumma? Why was this person plowing? And what is one of the sets of Malchus in for? For Kilei Akedem. Because his act of plowing, which is covering earth over those seeds. If the earth is tzunma, it's so rocky, it's so hard that it cannot even be made into a fine earth, usable for Kisei Adam. So why are you chayav for planting Kilei Akedem? Tzunma bar ziriyah. Answers the Gemara. Whoa, 1 second. It's only very rocky milmayla, but under the top there's afar tichuach, the soft earth. The soft earth is what's good for the planting. So it is an act of planting. But the top earth is too hard to do Kisei Adam. But the Gemara says, who cares? If you're doing an act of plowing, and even the upper layer is tzunma, but if underneath you have afar tichuach, so again, because of hoyel, you should not be chayv malchus for the act of charisha, because it's good for Kisei Adam. Tepu klei, mishom afar tichoyach. Answers the Gemara, Elo Omar Mar Baravashi. Again, we're all explaining Shitas Rabbah. We are not allowing this Mishnah to refute the principle of Hoyel. And indeed, in a normal scenario, you would not be chayiv for the act of Harisha. Why is that? Because Hoyel Chazi Likisei Adam. I have no bird. I have no need. If you were right now to shech the bird or a chaya, you would need the earth. You would be exempt. Eloma, the case is betina. That's already good.
Is there any quantity limited on that?
No, because you can argue you can shech 2 chayas, 3 chayas, 4 chayas, big chaya.
So even if I'm plowing fields, doesn't matter. Hoyel, if I shech a lot of birds, I need a lot of dirt covering.
You're not going to be chayiv malchus. So Imam Baravashi says that the Mishnah is betina. Betina works. Tina's mud. Mud, we'll see a certain type of mud is good enough to plant, but mud cannot be used for kisui dam, as we know from doing kaparas. Kisui dam has to be dry. You have to use something dry. Vitina bar zeriyahi. So the Gemara says, yeah, bimesunta. Yeah, it's a certain type of wet mud that you could plant in, but it's not royal kisui dam. So Rabbi is not refuted. Okay. So I think I spoke. Let's just go. We have time. The 1, 2, 3. The 4th Tosfos or the 5th Tosfos in the Amid. It's under the Gemara Ketisha b'Yamtav Mishari. We just spoke this out before. Like, well, hold on. If you say Hoyel, that will justify Charisha. Why will it not justify Ketisha? Hikshariva my parach havade shari k'may Charisha. The shari mishum Hoyel hachinam Ketisha. Okay, that's his kasha. And v'oy teima hechi parachache the lesa asay di kisui adam, and it should be doicha the lav of plowing on yomtiv. Ha'ein yomtiv nitcha mepnei asay, and he quotes from Ketzat Soilen because of the rule that yomtiv is an essay and a loisaseh. So how does the whole thing work over here? That's an important tosfos over here. So answers umefarash Rashbam. You see that we're somewhere middle of the tosfos. Hoyel v'chazi likisui dam tzipur. Loi mishum the chiya ka'amar. It's not. We're not being doiche yomtiv. Ela mishum the oz leitzarech lecharisha ela laafra. This is gavaldik. It's not about we're being doiche yomtiv. When you plow because you need the offer, what is that called? A malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. When you grind because you need the dust to cover the dam, that's a malacha shetzricha legufa. And we're not going to say that the mitzvah say of kisui dam, the gavaldik, is doicha yomtiv. Why would it be doicha yomtiv? Esa doicha loisase, but yomtiv is both an esa and a loisase. The word of you can do charisha if you need the offer to cover the dam. Look at oil. Oil means that if you were to have dam tzipor or dam chaya, then you would be plowing in order only to get to earth. It would render the act of charisha into a malacha she'en etzricha lagufa. And we're going to go with Shitas Rab Shimon, malacha she'en etzricha lagufa. Midrabanan is not allowed, but it's not malchus. Beautiful. That's the kasha of the Gemara. And that's why Ketisha, even though you're doing it for Kisei Adam, is not an answer. You can't say, well, I need it for Kisei Adam, because if you grind something to make it into offer, you're doing grinding for grinding. Unlike Charisha, when you're doing Charisha only for the earth, that's the Malacha She'en Etzricha L'Gufa. That's one of the examples of Malacha She'en Etzricha L'Gufa, that you're Chayfer Boyer, Ve'en Etzorech Ala Afra. Back in the Gemara. We're back here into the Machlokes Rabbi and Abchizda, not the first one about doing Malach and Yom Tov for Shabbos, but we're back to the original Machlokes, which is going to be linked to the Mishnah that we have to still remember, which is whether we subscribe to Hoyel or not. The Rabbi subscribes to Hoyel, and Abchizda does not. So Esvei, this is another kasha against the Rabbi. Esvei Abaye, his student, he quoted the Baraisa, a similar scenario to that we had in Masechta Makos, similar meaning that there's sometimes that a person does one single act and they're violating many lavin. If you cooking gid hanoshe in milk on Yom Tiv and you eat it, wow, oigevalt, like a chamesh, you're gonna get 5 malchus in. What's the 5? Like this. Like mishum avashal gid hanoshe b'Yom Tiv. When are we allowed to cook, bake? Soirech oichel nefesh. Gid hanoshe is not allowed to be consumed. It goes back to the issue we had in the Mishnah. Challah, that's tameh, cannot be consumed. You're not allowed to cook it on Yom Tov. So you like it for violating Yom Tov. That's number 1. Number 2, the loike mishum oichel gid. We're speaking about the case of the Baraisa. It wasn't only the act. Like in the Mishnah Makos, it was one act of plowing. Here you cooked it and then you ate it. So you're a loike because you ate gid hanoshe. Number 3, you're like it because you cooked basar b'chalav. You cooked basar. Obviously, we had this above. If we limit the area of the gid hanoshe, and it only includes the gid, and if ain't the gid b'noisam tam, then that won't be included here. But that does not follow those shitas. Here we're following the shita that there is more of the gid that's asad, or there is tam in the gid. It's considered basar. So that's 3. Cooking basar b'chalav is an isur. Then there's another one, like we mentioned by basar b'chalav. We just had this above. Basar b'chalav is an isur to cook it, and another separate isur to eat it. But hold on, that's 4. Where's the 5th? So says the Baraisa mishum havara, lighting a fire independent of cooking, baking, lighting a fire. If it's not for making food that you are allowed to eat, making a fire is also asur. Nekuda. Asks the Gemara, you should not be chayiv for havara. Why not? If you will have regular kosher food that you would like to cook, you would have a fire for it. So why are you chayiv for havara? Kasha against Rabbi. And this kasha is so strong, since we're not dealing with a Mishnah, we're dealing with a Baraisa, and a Baraisa sometimes is corrupted. So we're going to indeed change the Baraisa. Amar Lei says Rabba, the Baraisa is not authoritative. Apik havara. Now the Baraisa is something went wrong. You remember there was a case that the Tanaim spoke about that you chayiv 5, but the 5th one is not havara. For havara, no hoyel. Apik havara va'ayil gid hanoshe shel nevela. In other words, there's a separate law for eating the nevela. Says the Gemara that don't corrupt the Baraisa in that direction. I'll tell you why. Because like we mentioned, Baraisas, there are different types of Baraisas. Any Baraisa that was learned in the yeshiva of Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Oishia is authoritative. This Baraisa was not taught verbatim in Rabbi Chia, but there is a footnote that was taught in the school of Rabbi Chia on this Baraisa. The Hatani Rabbi Chia concerning this case, that when we speak about 5, how do we divide the 5? 2 of them are in Isur Achila, which ones were the 2 guys for eating Gid Hanoshe, right? And eating Basar B'chalav. And 3 of the 5 was regarding cooking. What was the 3? Well, it was making the fire before we delete it, because of cooking on Yom Tiv and because of cooking Basar B'chalav. Now, if you're going to take out Havara, and you're putting in nevela, so then Rab Chia wouldn't have said 2 for eating and 3 for cooking. Ve'im isa shalish alechilasi miboyale. And what Rab Chia said is authoritative. So I can accept that Rabbi can amend the Baraisa, but not in this direction. Indeed, says the Gemara, Ella apikavana. And you know what you have to put in? Atzei muksa, haha, hachana de Rabba. Here we go, guys. What is atzei muksa? If you have wood prior to Shabbos or prior to Yontif, you said, I will not use this. You specifically set it aside from it being used. That's the highest level of muksa. Even according to the Tanach Rab Shimon, if you remember in Shabbos, Rabbi Yehuda Rab Shimon, right? Rabbi Yehuda holds that if it was not muchand, it's automatically muksa. Rab Shimon holds you have to be maktzia it. Here you were maktzia it. Number one. Number two, this is very important, that what we are speaking here is if someone said, this I will not use on Shabbos and Yontif. And then what? If they then move it, no one holds your over an Isser Doiraisa, moving it. But if you use it, according to Rabba, you're chayiv malchus. Wow. And that's called hachana. Hachana means, since it was not designated for it being used, when you use it, part of using it means it's included. You're being meichen it for it being used. B'haraya, you're using it. An act of designation, which is really a mental designation, is considered something significant. It's considered a malacha. When God says, don't do malacha, it included not being meichen something on Yom Tov. Hachana de Rabba. Here we go. Rabba says yes. And what's my source? Because it says on Parshas B'Shalach regarding the month that that on Friday, not only does the Torah write, it's going to fall a double portion, right? But it says vehechinu. That's the key. Eis asher yaviu, prepare the man. And like Rashi speaks, we're going to learn this in Beitza, in the beginning, the first daf of Beitza. The pshat, when you learn in Cheder, vehechinu means that bake it, cook it. You know, it's bake it and cook it on Friday. Don't bake it and cook it on Shabbos. Says Rabbi, of course, that's not the pshat. We already know independently that you're not allowed to bake on Shabbos and not allowed to cook on Shabbos. So when Moshe Rabbeinu was telling them, prepare it, that means something else, that you have to designate it for it to be eaten. Because if it was not designated to be eaten prior to Shabbos, if you will eat it on Shabbos, eating it means that now you're using it. That act is called an act of hachana, not the eating part. The moment before the eating, you're going to be eating it. And hachana is something that's usher. Where did God say you can't do it? Doesn't say don't do hachana. Rabbi includes it. So if the wood that you were using to cook this gid hanashe b'chalav is atzei muksa, that's your fifth. And by the way, that fits with Rab Chia. Rab Chia says shalosh al bishulay. That's traditional. Okay, beautiful. Amalei. So Abaye challenges Rabbi. To the amrat. Oh, you yourself told us. Abaye was a student. That once, I Rabbi once asked my teacher Rab Chisda, or another version says that Rabbi shared with his Talmidim, including Abaye, that Ba'ai minei, that I once asked my other teacher Rav Huna. What was his question? If you have a lamb which is really fit to be used as a carbon tamid, but before Yontif came in, before Shabbos came in, this animal was out there. It was out in the swamp. In other words, it was not going to be used. It was far away from where people live. Okay, distant pasture. And for whatever reason, they didn't have enough animals in the Lishkas HaTaloyim. And we learned so many details. They had reserved Taloyim, and they were checked 4 days prior. That's ideal. They did not have it over here. And what happens if they take this lamb and they shecht it for the Tamid B'Yamtiv? Mahu. What's the mahu? Rashi explains the kasha that he asked his teacher was, are you allowed after the shechita to offer it on the mizbeach? What's the issue? We'll explain. It's muktzah. And on that, and what va'at amrat lon, and you shared with us your question, and then you told us what they responded. So Abaye is reminding Rabbi, either Rab Chisda or Rav Huna. And what did they respond? That there's a pasuk that we have in Yecheskel. I'm reading the pasuk in Rashi. It says, "V'seh achas min hatzoin," and one sheep from the flock, Min ha-mosayim from 200, mimashke Yisrael, from that which is fit for a banquet for the Jewish people. It's an enigmatic pasuk. What is that pasuk referring to? So when they responded to this question, they broke down this verse and they learned many dinim regarding the Talmud from this pasuk in Yecheskel. That when Yecheskel says viseh, that comes to teach you that an animal that is a bechor cannot be used for the carbon Talmud. Obviously, if you have enough animals, who would want to do that? What happens if there's, like our case, there's a lack of lambs? And the only lamb you have is a bechor. Can you use, now a bechor has to be offered on the Mizbeach anyways. I know that. But can you use it for a carbon Talmud? So we learn over here, seh v'lo ya bechor. Why? So Rashi explains, because since a seh, which is fit for a carbon Talmud, can be both Zajac and the Keva, and the bechor is dafka male, so it cannot be used for that, because the bechor is dafka male. Next, the last line in the Amid, achas, this is the next word in the pasuk in Yecheskel. Achas teaches you that if you have an animal that was already meiser behema, again, there's a lack, sadly, in the Beis Hamikdash of lambs for the Talmud. You can't use it for a Talmud because meiser behema is 1 from 10. With all of the pratim, you have to put 10 in a pen and you have to count 1, 2, 3. The 10th is 1 out of 10. And the carbon Talmud is called achas. So you can't use a meiser behema for a carbon Talmud. When it says in the next word in the pasuk in Yecheskel, from tzoin, what does that teach you? V'lo ha-palgos, if you remember. Guys, keves is a lamb within the first year. Ayol, same animal, but it's an adult, a ram in English, right? An ayal. What's an ayal? It's good to remember this. We have this in Kachin. Not in the second year, only from the 14th month. An animal in the 13th month, right? It's like as by a girl, you have a ketana and you have a nana and a boigeres. It's like in between nishtahen and nishtahin. That's called a palgas. It's halb gebaken. An animal that's 13 months old is not allowed to be used for a keves. Daf memches. When it says weiter in Yecheskel min ha-mosayim, it doesn't work. It cannot be referring to an animal. It's referring to now nesachim. That if you have wine, and the wine that you have is 1 from 200, then it's okay. What are we talking about? So he says, wow. What happens if something not kosher gets mixed into kosher? What do we know what the rule is? Couple of steps. Number 1, bittul b'roiv. Number 2, that we just learned the sugi of tam ke'ikir. How much do you need to be mevatel the tam? 60. But if there's no mixture of tam, when do you have the bittul b'roiv? We have an exception, truma. By truma, how much do you need to be mevatel truma? Not roiv, even if there's no mixture of tam, a ratio of 100 to 1. Now really there's a mechilta that Rashi reminds us of, there's a sefri that learns from there that orlon kila yakerem, whose isur is not only achila, like we have by truma, for a non-kohen, but it's also an isur hana is doubled. If by truma you have to have a ratio of 100 to 1, or you have to have a ratio of 200 to 1. That's the real source. But now we have a remez from the pasuk in Yecheskel, that when Yecheskel says that you can use wine as long as it is 1 from 200, that means that if there was a vat of wine and a portion of arla fell in, or kilei akedem, but there's so much extra in the vat that if you remove that amount, you'll still have 200 parts, ratio 200 to 1, then you have bittul. And at kedei kach that you can use this for nesachim. So again, from here, min ha-mosayim, mi moiser, shtei meish and shtei b'ber, mikan, the word mikan means eremes, because really, like we mentioned, the source is from the din of truma. La'arla, shebetela b'mosayim. The final words in the pasuk in Yecheskel is mimashke Yisrael. Mimashke Yisrael means not from what we call a Hasidah mashke. Mashke here means that you can only offer on the Mizbeach something that could be served in a feast eaten by Yidden, which really means, say Chazal, do you know what you can put on the Mizbeach? Only something that is kosher for bechulin. That's something fit to give to God. If something is not mutter for a Yid, you're not allowed to offer it to Hashem. Min ha-mutter li-Yisrael, mikan amru, ein miviyin nesachem min ha-tevel. For example, if the grapes were not tied, you can't bring the sachem from it. Now, continues the Braisa continues the teaching that the Rabbi is repeating. Yachol yavi min hamuktzah. What happens if you have something that was set aside not to be used? Can you use it now for a korban? Amrat, because that was the whole kasha. The kasha was you had the lamb. The lamb was muktzah. Can you offer it as a korban tamid? So you're going to come and say, of course you can't, because mimashke Yisrael, it's muktzah. Can't eat muktzah. No. To which we said, no, you can't compare it to the case of tevel. Ma tevel meyuchad shisurei gufay. Gadam, like tevel has an inherent prohibition when it's grown right away. The Torah says before you separate the tithings, you can't eat it. That's called an isur gufay. It's inherently not good. And that cannot be offered on the mizbeach. But what else? Afkol she'isur gufay goyim loy. Yotza muktzeh she'ein isur gufay goyim loy. Ela isur davar acher goyim loy. Since it's not inherently muktzeh, what makes something muktzeh? You decided not to use it. You set it aside. That's considered an isur that comes from a external factor. That all this Rabbi quoted this Rebbe. That, in other words, a lamb ma'afar, which is muktzah. If you already slaughtered it, you can offer it. You can offer it on the mizbeach. First wide line. Now, finally, we come to the question. You Rabbi hold achana de Rabba. I don't understand. If something is us in midoraisa, then it's just like tevel, and it's not mashke Yisrael. It's not min hamutar. It's not min hamutar li Yisrael. That's number one. Number two, va'oid. Let me go b'chlal on your shita. To the amrat, you Rabbi, you are explaining the braisa that what is the fifth set of malkis? You added that it's the atzei are muktzah. That doesn't work. And let's remember a klal, guys. We learned this in Masechta Shabbos. This is the rule in Shabbos. If a person violates all of the lametes malachas on a Shabbos, b'shoigeg, not shigigas Shabbos. He knows it's Shabbos. Shigigas malachas. The rule is he has to bring 39 chatois, not by Yontif. If a person, God forbid, now by the way, on Yontif, b'shoigeg, there's no punishment. The punishment for breaking Yontif is b'mezid malchus. If a person b'mezid breaks all of the lametes malachis on one day Yontif, he only gets one set of malchus. For ha'at, you, Rabbi, taught chilik malachis is only l'Shabbos. The ein chilik malachis li'Yontif. So, Bachal, how can you teach the braisa that you're going to get another set of malchus because you broke muktzah? Okay, muktzah is awesome midairaisa, and it says loisasa melacha. But you're already getting another set of malchus for cooking on yontav, something that you can't eat, aside of the wood being muktzah. So that doesn't add anything. So answers the Gemara, Ella apik havara, you're right. Rabbi standing his ground. Hoyel means that you're not going to be chayiv malchus for making a fire, even though you're using it for something that you can't eat because hoyel. So we're missing one set of malchus. If you have wood, that's avodah zarah wood, and you're using it, that's nothing to do with yontif. That's a separate lav. And the hazara ma'achet says in the Elo yidbak b'yadcha ma'uma menacheder, which means you can't use it. That's the source from where you get malchus for using avodah zarah. Says the Gemara, can be. If the wood was an avodah zarah, you chayv 2 sets of malchus. The Braisa should have said 6 malchus. Don't bring a television in your house. This is a isur. You can't bring avodah zarah into your house, aside of using it. So if the Braisa would have been speaking about atzei hasheda, there would have been 6 malchus in. Ella, the final one succeeds. Elo apik havara v'ayilatzei hegdish. If the wood belonged to hegdish, and it says v'ashedeim tisrifun b'eish loy sasum kein lashem alekechem, something that belongs by hegdish, simply burning it, the burning of it itself is violating this lav. That is going to be the 5th. Bottom line is Rabbah is not refuted. Rabbah subscribes to hoyel. Wherever hoyel can be said, and there's a lot of lumdus in exactly when you say it, when you cannot say it, then the action certainly will not be punishable on a biblical level. Actually, in many scenarios, the action itself is going to be permitted. Let's go to Eid of Tafshilin just to make that clear. Hoyel itself doesn't allow you to do it. That's important. Hoyle and Erev Tavshilin, but Hoyle takes it down a notch. It's no longer us and Midoraisa, God willing, to be continued.
Yeah.
Guys, we're good? We're going to have to remember the Mishnah of Rabbi. We'll repeat it. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua. All right. This is the easy daf. Let's go. With the help of Hashem, we are learning PESACHIM daf mem ches. We will now go back, first of all, to the sugya that we are into, which is the sugya of Hoyle. Rabbi Rab Chizda argue whether we subscribe to what we call the Hoyle principle. Rabbi does say Hoyle. Rab Chizda rejects Hoyle. And the Gemara now is going to go back to the Mishnah on Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph in the bottom, Daf Mem Vav on the days on the top. The Machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. That's how we began this whole sugya of a person who has dough that's tamei on Pesach. That's not chametz on Pesach, but you're making it into bread, and obviously you want to put it into the oven ASAP to make sure it doesn't turn into chametz. The problem is that you did not remove challah. The problem is challah that's tamei may not be baked on Yom Tov, farvas nish, because since it cannot be eaten, something that cannot be eaten you cannot break the Yom Tov for preparing it. So what do you do? So Rabbi Eliezer says, indeed, if you will allow it to become chametz, Rabbi Eliezer holds, you, the owner, you're going to be violating Bal Yiro Bal Yamatz. So what should you do? Bake all of the breads. Now we're going to focus on another issue. How can I bake all the breads since I will be separating challah after they're baked? I know I resolved the chametz issue, but the one that I separated, look back, you put that in the oven. That was not something that was allowed to be put in the oven. Why would that be permitted? That's something that we're going to speak about here. Clearly, we mentioned it when we learned the Mishnah. Rabbi Yeshua, because of this, doesn't allow you to do that. Adarabba, Rabbi Yeshua says, let it be, separate the challah from the dough as we normally should. Don't do anything with it. Yes, it could become chametz. Who cares? You're not the owner. It doesn't belong to you. It's not yours. It's holy. It's challah. It belongs to a kohen. A kohen will violate. Exactly which kohen will violate? Don't give it to the kohen. Don't give it to our kohen. That was the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. And now we're going to begin today's daf in linking the machlokes Rabbi and Rabbi Chizda into this machlokes of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. We're going to speak more about the chiyuv challah. We're going to speak about this concept of that if you did not separate challah from a dough, then yes, you could separate challah after the item was baked, but let's not forget that when it comes to the chiyuv of challah, there is a minimum shiur, there's a minimum amount of dough that you need, the flour that you need for you to be obligated to separate challah. Now it's common, right? We're going to go, we here make a bracha, is when you have 5 pounds of flour. From 2.5 pounds to 5 pounds, we have a question whether that's the shiur of the oimer. But be that as it may, that's normal that when you make challah for Shabbos, you're beginning with a whole pound, a whole bag a bag of flour many times is 5 pounds. But if you're separating challah from baked loaves, whether they're chametz dek, whether they're matzah, one loaf doesn't have the minimum shiur. So how is there b'chlal a chiyuv? So we're going to learn about the concept of tziruf, that when you put the finished items into a basket, it combines them. We're going to learn many details about that. And by the way, this is all done today. Today, when they make matzah in a matzah factory, not wanting to lose 1 second if it's not necessary, they don't separate challah when it's a dough. They keep on manipulating. They're moving it around with Allah chumras, and they make the holes in the matzahs. They do everything you could to make sure it doesn't even come close to becoming chametz. But after you remove it from the oven, it's right away put into a basket. It's gathered, and you separate challah mit bracha afterwards. We're going to have on Daf Mem Ches on the days, we're going to have 2 Mishnayos. One of them is going to speak about the scenario where you have a very small oven. It's amazing that they used to bake bread products on Pesach. No one does that today. But obviously, they would make sure it doesn't become chametz. What's going to happen if you have 3 women baking, but the oven is only large enough to contain the dough of one? We're going to see how should they bake their bread, whether they can all knead the dough at the same time, even though it means that the third woman, the one who's going to use the oven the last, her dough is going to be sitting the most amount of time. Or we're going to say we're not allowed to do that. They have to figure out a system, as we'll see in the Mishnah, that when the first one needs, the other two are doing nothing. They don't mix the flour and the water. When the first one is beginning to shape, that is when woman number 2 begins to knead. When woman number 1 takes her shape breads, she puts them in the oven, which is when woman number 2 is beginning to shape it. Only then is where woman number 3 should begin to knead. And we'll see more details about that sugya. And on the end of Daf Mem Ches, if we learn properly the sugya of shiur, we learned it properly a few daf ago, that will be the ground zero of shiur. We began this Perek speaking about taroivus chametz and chametz nuksha. Chametz nuksha means chametz that's not edible. From the beginning, it was never fully edible. That includes shiur, not so'oid. Shiur means dough that's not fully chametz dikiyet. Dough b'chlal is not edible, and it's not even fully chametz. So really, there's a machlokes tanoim. From what step is it shiur? Then there's another machlokes. Okay, even if it is shiur, are you violating an iser d'oraisa? We had in the beginning of the Masechta that you are. Not kares, but you're chayv as malchus. That will be the shita. Now we'll see machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. No one says me that Rabbanan you can eat shiur, but only Rav Meir subscribes to chametz nuksha's isur lav. According to Rabbi Yehuda, even though you shouldn't eat it, but if you eat it, not only will you not get kares, you will also not get malchus and a lot more. We are in Daf Mem Ches. We are already 13 lines from the top of the Amid. That was important because that we concluded the hoyel, the challenges against the Rabbah. Now it's an established machlokes. And now again, we're going to try to link the machlokes Tanoim with the machlokes of hoyel. Now, under one more nakuda, just to rechazer, that the machlokes of Rabbi and Abchizda wasn't a theoretical machlokes. Their case was what happens if someone bakes on Yom Tov l'choyel. That was their case. You're not allowed to bake Yom Tov l'choyel. Rabbi Chizda says you're chayiv malchus. Rabbi says you shouldn't have. Now that you did it, you're not going to be chayiv malchus because hoyel, if guests would come and they would eat it on Yom Tov and you would serve it to them, so it was no longer Yom Tov l'chol, even though you already ate and you didn't know of guests coming. That's the source of hoyel, which means that if you're going to make a linkage, if you're going to say that there is a Tana that subscribes to hoyel, he will also hold that if you bake on Yom Tov l'choyel, you won't be chayiv malchus. Says the Gemara. Amar Rami Bar Chama. I want you to know that the Rav Chizda v'Rabba, their machlokes is the same machlokes of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. And that's the way he explains the Mishnah. The Rabbi Eliezer Savar, again, when we learned the Mishnah, we were primarily focusing on, are you going to get baliro bal yamatzah for allowing that piece of dough that's designated in Techala become chametz? We focused on that 2 daf ago. Now we're focusing on a new issue. What's the new issue? That Rabbi Eliezer's solution, Rabbi Eliezer is machmed on one hand, because he says, you're going to violate baliro bal yamatzah. You have to make sure it doesn't turn into chametz. What was his solution? Baking it all. But now let's focus. Hold on, how can I bake the whole dough? Some of it will be separated in challah after it was baked. But l'chayra, retroactively, that should never have been baked. You baked something that cannot be edible. You violated the lav, l'sasem ulach. What must the answer be? Rabbi Eliezer holds you say hoyel. Let me explain hoyel. And there are 2 steps over here. I mean, there's so many beautiful ways of understanding it, but listen to this. When you put all the dough, when you separate challah from the dough, you separate one piece. If there's a chiyuv midoraisa, so it's echad michav daled, echad mimem ches. When the chiyuv challah is only midrabanan, so like nowadays, you separate a piece. A woman doesn't have to, there's no shiurim right now. But you separate one piece from one dough. What happens in our case, where a person did not separate the challah from the dough? You baked here matzah, and you're putting them together. Now that you separate challah, you have 2 options. One option is from every matzah, from every loaf, you separate a piece. If you were to do it that way, you're not violating anything. Because what's the violation? Who gave you permission to bake it? You can't eat it. It's not true. Every loaf is also going to be eaten. But people don't do that. You're ruining the shleimas. We all suffer today with shleimas. It's a lot more work. Normally what you would do is you would take one matzah, and that would be challah on behalf of all the other ones. Here is where you have a problem. What's the problem? The problem is that if one entire matzah is going to be designated as challah, so then who gave you the right to bake that challah, to bake that matzah? That is all challah, right? Breda, you know now it's you violated an Isur D'Oraisa. So the answer is hoil. Since if I wanted, I would be able to separate from each individual loaf a piece, and then I can separate challah without violating anything. Even if I don't do that, no one does that. Hoil, that's the word. And Rabbi Yeshua does not subscribe to hoil, so that's why he doesn't allow you to do that solution. So the Gemara says that I reject Rami's link, Sai Rabbi Eliezer and Sai Rabbi Yeshua. Let's begin with Rabbi Eliezer. For that comes Rav Papa. Amar Rav Papa Viv Dilma, maybe Akan look at Eliezer Hassan, that yes, we say hoil. Who says we're subscribing to hoil? I'm not subscribing to hoil at all. Forget about hoil. We said this when we learned the Mishnah. When you put it into the oven, you did not yet know which one will become challah. So when you put it into the oven, the person says, this one won't be challah. Then you put another loaf in. The next one won't be challah. Like Rashi says, maybe the heter of Rabbi Eliezer is not because he uses hoil. What does he say? I'm reading the words of Rashi. I know there's a Breda issue. Oh, everyone speaks about it. But I'm saying that's Rav Papa. Lav dafka, he needs hoil. There's another way out. Aval hacha, but over here, that when a person is baking, what's the case of Rabbi and Rab Chizda? You're baking on Yom Tov l'choil because I'm satisfied. I'm not eating. But over here, the lo'urchem hu de chazi. Even if guests come, it's only good for the guests. But I don't plan to eat it, and I will not eat it. So maybe. And therefore, maybe Rabbi Eliezer will hold that Yechayiv Malchus. That is how we don't link Rabbi Eliezer to Hoyel. That's Rav Papa. And Amar Rav Shisha, but Rav Idi, same regarding Rabbi Yeshua from a different direction. The Dilma, don't say that Rabbi Yeshua holds like Rabbi Chizda. Maybe he doesn't. At kan loika Amar Rabbi Yeshua Hasam, that we don't say Hoyel. Ella, the Ika Chada, the Loichazia Loila Archin. Because since one, we're speaking about people don't do the first option. When you separate one at the end for challah, that one is not good for anyone. That's really a problem. Not you can eat it, not the kohen. No one is allowed to eat truma tamei. Avalacha, but here in the case of their machloikas, baking, cooking on Yom Tov for choil, even though you will not eat it, but at least the chazi miyas la'archim, maybe here he will say hoyel. In other words, this is like we mentioned a few times already, that hoyel is one of these tools that you have to put some limit on it. It's not a sum zero. Do you subscribe to hoyel or not? Because really, so many things can become muttered from using hoyel. There's a limit to it. Hoyel means, like he's saying over here, that maybe if the food that you're making could be eaten, he'll say hoyel. But when you're putting loaves into an oven, we're not going to say, since you could have broken challah, we're not going to say that. If you're going to end up taking off an entire one for challah, that one is not edible for no one, that's a problem. Okay, look at that. So Bekitzer, Rami links their machlokes, and the other Amoraim push back. Now the Gemara says a story that Amru Rabbanan Kamed Rabbi and Rab Zera. The Chevra, the Rabbanan, when they heard the Rami's link, they repeated it in front of Rabbi and Rab Zera. And Rabbi Yirmiyah was excited. Gavaldik. Oh, now I understand the Mishnah better. And Rab Zera rejected it. Now there's a history over here. What's the history? That Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rab Zera for many years were struggling to understand the Machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. And this is finally a good insight. So Amalei Rabbi and Rab Zera, I don't understand you. Milsa de Kashyulon, something that we had a hard time understanding. You know for how long? Ba'asya Kamashani. For many years, we were discussing that we don't understand Shitas Rabbi Eliezer. That was the issue. How can you put it into the oven? B'may pligi Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. And now finally comes along a great man, Rami, and Amruah Mishmei de Gabra Rabba, that Rabbi Eliezer allows you to do it because of the principle of Hoyel. How can you not accept it? It's Gavaldik. So Amalei, how can I accept it? Hecha Kabla. Ditanina. I'll tell you why I won't accept it. You know why I won't accept it? Because we have in a Braisa that Amalei Rabbi Shua Lidvarecha, Harei Oivin Mishum Leisasa Komalacha. I know the Mishnah doesn't address it that much. The Mishnah is addressing more about Baliro Bal Yamatza. But in a Braisa, Rabbi Shua tells Rabbi Eliezer, how can you bake it? Like we are mentioning, when you're going to separate one loaf as challah, which that is something not edible, not for you, not for a kohen, retroactively you're violating, you're baking on Yom Tov, something that's not edible. And you know what Rabbi Eliezer responded? Nothing. No, so therefore, you're explaining the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer that if you subscribe to Hoyel, you have a Hoyel heted. But the Im Isa, if indeed Rabbi Eliezer would have been using Hoyel, why didn't Rabbi Eliezer respond to Rabbi Yeshua? In other words, the lack of a recorded response, does that prove that they don't hold of that potential response? He's proposing, the fact that he didn't give that teretz is because he doesn't accept that teretz. Says the Gemara, no, that's not a good klal. Many times when two people are arguing, two Tanaim, two Amirayim, and we should learn from it, you don't always have to give an answer. Not because you don't know. Even if you know the answer, just because you don't give an answer, or more, just because your answer is not recorded in the works of Tanaim, it doesn't mean that you don't give that answer. According to you, since it's not recorded, that means he doesn't subscribe to it. Let me ask you, on this machlokes, there's another Braisa. Rabbi Eliezer challenges Rabbi Yeshua. What do you say? You say simply, don't bake it. Don't bake it. Right? So how can you just leave it? Rabbi Eliezer tells Rabbi Yeshua, you're violating Bali Rabbi Matzah. In that Braisa, there's zero response. Vishasikle, hachinami, deloyahadele. What you think that he did not respond? We know that he responded. In our Mishnah, it says the response, right? We know he answered. The answer is recorded in our Mishnah. The Tanach in our Mishnah, because it's not locha. Elo, just because the answer, the response is not recorded in the Braisa, it doesn't mean it's not recorded in any else. Forget, it's not recorded in the Braisa, but so hachinami, maybe the Braisa that you quoted, there Rabbi Eliezer doesn't respond. But maybe the answer is recorded in another location. But maybe whether we have it or whether we don't have this, mechilta means a medrash. You know, it's just because you don't find a recorded response, it doesn't mean that they don't subscribe to that response. So now we have today a machlokes amoyroyim, whether we can link Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua to this question of Hoyel. Says the Gemara by Tanya, Rabbi Oma Oimer Halachik Rabbi Eliezer, which is that taka bake it. Whether you're going to apply Hoyel or whether it's not because of a bake it. And then separate chal. Rabbi Yitzchak Omar Nish Halachis Keben Beseira. Interestingly, we did not speak about him. Ben Beseira does not agree with Rabbi Yeshua. Ben Beseira, but on the other hand, Ben Beseira doesn't want for you to have chametz. In other words, he doesn't agree with Rabbi Yeshua. He doesn't agree with Rabbi Eliezer because of the problem that we're learning about today. How can you bake something that's going to turn out to be challah? Challah cannot be baked. Challah tmeya cannot be baked on Yom Tov. So Rabbi Beseira says, soak it in cold water. Now, starts the Gemara. Yes.
According to Ben Beseira, you keep it in cold water till after Pesach?
This happened on the first day Yom Tov until Chol HaMoed. On Chol HaMoed, you can bake.
Okay, so you bake it and then you burn it? What's the...
Yeah.
Okay.
The Kamashid Esau. So as we have been speaking, that whenever there's an issue of some dough becoming chametz, it's all theoretically when you're not working with the dough, when you're letting it sit. When you're working with it, theoretically, there's no shiur of meal. Then even more than 18 minutes, it's not going to become chametz. But you know what? If you are making a very large dough, and even though you're kneading it and you're working with it, because of its size, so between, for you to get to all parts of it, the larger, the more time it takes. And we are continuously doing it from one manipulation until the next manipulation, it can become chametz, which is why it's better for you not to make large doughs. So that's the Gemara's kasha now. The kama shiur isa. When you are kneading doughs, what is the limit that Chachamim said, don't make a dough larger than, because it might now become chametz, because again, you won't have enough time to get to the same place twice until it turned into chametz. So here we have like this. Tanoi, Rabbi Shmuel ben Oishel, Rabbi Yechon ben Reika Omer, if you're making a dough made out of wheat, chitin, so then kavin, two kav, every kav is 12 eggs, 24 eggs. In other words, if you would make a dough larger than it, then it might turn into chametz. Now, obviously, if you're going to make it within 18 minutes, it's not going to become chametz, because we just learned above that even if you don't manipulate it, it doesn't become chametz. But they didn't have the 18 minutes then. They wanted to be not so rushed. But if you're making a dough made out of barley, then shloishes kabin. In other words, this Tana holds, Rabbi Shmuel Benoi holds, that barley ferments slower, and therefore you can use a larger dough. However, says the Braisa, that Rab Nassan says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, chiluf advarim, punkt verkehrt, that barley becomes chametz quicker than chitin. A very interesting machlekes, whether this is a machlekes mitzias that we really try to avoid, but here we have a machlekes. Fragt die Gemara on Rabbi Shmuel vehotanya, Rabbi Shmuel ben Omer, no, chitin 3 kav, so oirin 4 kav. The kasha is not on Rabbi Shmuel shita that barley ferments slower. No, barley ferments slower. But the shiurim is not 2 to 3, it's 3 to 4. So there's another nuance. Says the Gemara like kasha. The second statement, the second braisa that you quoted, is bachasi chasa, where the grain is of poorer quality. The first braisa is b'maliyasa, where the grain is of better quality. Guys, good grain ferments quicker. Makes a lot of sense. Like, if there's more kedusha, there's more potential tumah. Chitin, even according to Rabbi Shmuel, barley to begin with is inferior, it ferments slower. Barley is considered inferior. So in chitin itself, if it's better, b'ma'aliyasa, then it ferments quicker. So then it's 2. If it's inferior, 3. Amar Rav Papa, shmami no, listen to this. According to the Shita, Giriim, chite chasi chasa michitim aliyasa, that poor wheat in relation to good wheat is more inferior, right? Is more tfei, it's more inferior midigarinim saare chasi chasa misaram aliyasa, from poor barley in relation to good barley. Vaspshat, he explains the ilu hasam by the wheat tilsam. Guys, let's go from Rabbi Shmuel. If it's inferior wheat, you can make 3 kav. If it's superior wheat, you can only make the max of 2 kav, the isa, ideally. Now, 2 to 3, we're using the larger amount. So it's a third more, right? 3, if you're using the inferior amount, a third of the larger amount is the difference between inferior and superior by the wheat. A third. However, by barley, because by the barley it was 4 if it's inferior, 3 if it's superior, but the difference between them is only a quarter, which is less. So amazing. So wheat is more inferior. The difference between inferior wheat and superior wheat, gavaldik, is greater than the difference of inferior barley to superior barley. Okay, Amar Rav. This is a typical case where Rav is a Tana, like a Tana, and he argues with them because we had this Kamashir Isa, 2 kav, 3 kav, 3 kav, 4 kav in this direction and the opposite direction, but no one gave a smaller shiur. Rav says, you know what? If you are making matzah on Pesach, and this will go to nowadays also, if you're making it before Pesach, the largest of a dough that you should make is what he calls kaba mi loignaa. Loignaa is a place, and the havamina is that a loignaa kav is your standard kav. The Gemara is not even asking how does he go against all the other Tanoim. We're not even asking that. That's a shiur that Rav heard from his teachers or Rav had on his own. He limits it only to a kav. And that din, Zajac Rav, is both lepischa, like we just learned the last line of Nashi, that it's better to make smaller doughs, which will prevent it from ever becoming chametz, because you're manipulating the dough, and because of its smaller size, you're constantly hitting every part of the dough. And v'chein lechala, that what's the minimum share from which you have to separate challah? 1 kav. Ooh, on that the Gemara says that can be. Frek the Gemara, and it says v'hatanya in parentheses, because it's really v'hatanan. Turning to Daf Mem Ches Amid Beis, we already had this so many times together on top of the Amid. When it comes to the shiur challah, chameshes revoyim kemach, maybe say va'oid machlokes in the shainim, whether you go to the va'oid. Guys, this is Eidavin Daf Pei Gimel. Go back there to learn all the details. Bottom line is 5 quarters means a kav and a quarter. A kav and a quarter. Kav and a quarter is the 43.2 or 43.3 eggs. That's what we said. We have a machlokes now in Periscope, whether that's 2.5 pounds, whether that's 5 pounds. But the shiur that the Chazal used is not 1 kav. It's 5 quarters of a kav. Only then are you chayiv and challah. Rav cannot argue. No one argues with that. We're not going to go that Rav is Tanu Palig on that. So therefore, the Gemara clarifies that when Rav said kav, that kav from the place of loy gna'ah, it's not a kav. Hachi ka'amar kava miloy gnoi nami ahai shiurekai. Now, the beauty, in other words, challah, taka, everyone has the same shiur. What the Rav is really adding is that when you learned Rabbi Shmuel Benoi, when you learned in the name of Rabbi Nassan, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, you can make a dough of 2 kav, of 3 kav, of 4 kav, says the Rav, no. Make it exactly the size that you're chayiv challah, so you're not losing the mitzvah of challah, but on the other hand, don't make a dough larger than that. That the smaller the dough, the less potential there is for it to become chametz. Amar Rabbi Yosef, this will be beautiful. You know, many times people are machmer, and when you really look at it, the chumrah brings a kula. So based on the premise that the smaller the dough, the less chance it's going to become chametz. So how about making those that are smaller? Indeed, Rabbi Yosef says, Hani Nashi Didan, our women, we're machmer. No, glamefa kefiza. Kefiza, we learned, is a 3/4 of a kav. When they make dough, they never make doughs larger than a kefiza. If they want a lot of matzah, they make many kefizas, but they never put them together. That they bake kefiza lepischa. Like, wow, like he's proud. So Amalei Abaye tells Rabbi Yosef, I don't understand my daiter. Right? You're speaking about a minig, which is l'chumra. I get it. Well, l'chumra, the asilei kuluhu. Very nice. It's a chumra, making sure that it won't even come near to become chametz. But on the other hand, you're bringing to a kula, the kamafkalei mechala. You are avoiding challah. And by the way, if you make small doughs together nowadays, you'll never be mechoyv to separate challah. But who fakir? We dafka at least make 2.5 pounds. We want to do a mitzvah. We're not looking to run away from mitzvahs. So now we go back to our Mishnah. What did we learn in our Mishnah? Rabbi Eliezer doesn't mind for you to separate challah after it's baked, because the sal is mitztaref. So comes along Rabbi Yosef and he says, no, you're missing the whole point. We go like Rabbi Eliezer. Amalei, the Avdon ke Rabbi Eliezer, like, again, it's not the Tanya, like we learned in our Mishnah, that Rabbi Eliezer, that's another Mishnah, that haroide, but it's like our Mishnah over here. Haroide, if you're removing bread from the oven, if you put it into a basket, even if you did not separate challah when you should have ideally, which is when it became a dough, you did not lose your opportunity because it's a finished product. No. Asal mitztarfa lachallah. And not only do we have such a shita, but furthermore, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, the first white line, we take a paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, Zajac Rabbi Yosef, that our chumrah is not coming to any kula. We make small doughs. Smaller the dough, the better when it comes to the problem of chametz. And we never lose the mitzvah of challah, because after it goes out of the oven, we put it in a basket, and then we have more. We have a kefiza and another kefiza. Boom, you got your share of challah, chameshes revoyim v'oid. Gavaldik. Amalei, so Abaye tells Rabbi Yosef, ha'itmar Allah, Amar Bishua ben Levi, loishanu ela ki karei shel bavel shenoish chezu mizu. Whoa. Yeah, when do we say that putting it in the basket effectively combines it? That is if there is something else. What's the something else? If you put doughs in an oven together, if the doughs are round, especially when they're round, then as they expand, they will go into each other, they will bite each other, and when the product is finished and you rip it apart, you're going to tell that you are ripping things apart. You know, guys, today with lechem mishnah, right? Is it a problem with lechem mishnah? Many times you buy these bilkalach that they were baked in the oven together. If they are round, why are you laughing then? If they're round and therefore not straight, they go into each other more, that's a greater combination. So did we not learn that only if it was done like in bubble, they make things round? If you remember from Shabbos, Daf Lamed Aleph, right? That he asked, that person asked Hillel, why are the heads of the Babylonians round? Maybe this is it. Anyway, Abel Ka'achin, but if they are long and narrow, they're not. And Rabbi Yosef never said that our women, they make sure to bake it round. So answers the Gemara, Farem Fring Rabbi Yosef, Itmar Allah, that we don't accept this Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. That Omar Rab Chanina, no, the concept that a sal combines the breads doesn't need to have this other precondition that they were connected one to each other. Even ka'achen, if you put them into a sal, hatzal mitzarfon. And on that, Shmuel says, halacha k'Rabbi Eliezer. So yes, we get the best of both worlds. We're machmir, but we do a chumrah that does not bring to a kula. Okay, now when we speak about the basket, combining it, let's go into pratim. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah, what happens if you put the matzahs, the loaves, after you remove them from the oven, into a flat board, onto a flat board, tabla, a tablet, meaning it doesn't have any vertical walls. There isn't a rim, not even a rim. It's just flat. Mahu, do we say toich kliba inan, that the pshat of the basket combining is because it has a receptacle, and this type of tabla has no receptacle, so it does not combine. Or no, avir keli bein. I know that's all you need. No, it's in the airspace of something that has on it other pieces of bread, and that you do have. For that we say teiko. This is a chassidish question. How much of a keli do you have to be called a keli? Okay, Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Oimer. Details coming.
In today's day, when they bake matzah, what do they practically do with the whole challah issue? Do they combine it afterwards, like exactly what we're talking about?
We do exactly what we spoke about. They put it in a basket. There is only the machlokes here amongst the Rishonim. The Rosh, I think that some of the Rishonim subscribe that Bamed Dvarim Amurim, when you remove it directly from the oven into the basket, directly, and the bread is not yet cooled off, because they understand that once the product is finished, you can't separate challah. Cooling off of the breads or of the matzahs, of the loaves, is part of the preparation for it. It's not ready yet. So it has to go directly from the oven into the basket. And that's like what they do. And we have other pratim about this challah. Tanya, different shittas. Rabbi Eliezer holds, like we just learned, only the tzal is mitztarif. You don't need anything else. Rabbi Yeshua holds that tanur mitztarfon, which is gavaldik. Rabbi Yeshua has either or, either in a basket, but he holds if they were baked in the same oven, they are combined because they were in the oven together. So even if you don't put them in a basket, you can also, if you have the sum total in the oven of the chameshes revoin kemach, the oid, or without the oid, right, the 5 pounds, then you make a bracha. Like we learned above, no, that kikare shall bubble. It has to be round, which is why so they bite into each other, and that is what it's mitztarfos. And if you don't have that part, then I don't care that they are in a tanur together. I don't even care if after being in a tanur together, you also have being in a cell together. Doesn't help you. So this is the 3-way machlokes tanoim. And again, like Danny, today we don't separate challah, which is a chumrah, because really it's not chametz dik yet. You're kidding. On so many levels, everything is done within the 18 minutes. Nevertheless, another chumrah to be away from it, even beginning to become chametz. We separate challah by matzahs after it goes oven, basket, hafrashas challah. Okay, moving on to the next Mishnah. We spoke out this Mishnah and the Gemara in the intro. Here we're having, says the Mishnah, 3 women, not 4. That's too much. 3 women or 2 women. But 3 women that are all kneading doughs. The challenge here is that the oven is only large enough to bake the amount of one at a time, of one woman at a time, which would mean that the other two women's doughs would be sitting. Now, we did learn a few daf ago that Kedei Hiluchmil, right? On daf mem vav. Oh, Kedei Hiluchmil means that even if the dough is sitting, 18 minutes. So this really comes into the sugya. So says that Rabbi Gamliel says, Sholish Nashim, Leifel Lashes Kachas, if it's not more than 3, if it's only 3, I don't mind if they knead together. Even though V'oifes B'tanur Echad, even though they're baking in one oven, and the oven is so small that Zuach Harzu, which means that, listen, the second woman at least will wait less, but the third woman, her dough will go into the oven the farthest away bisman from when she finished kneading it and shaping it, from when she stopped manipulating it. It doesn't matter if it's only 3 women, that amount of time is not enough for it to become chametz. Wait. Says Chachamim, no, Shalish Nashim, Oiskois the Batze Ka'achas, well, the only way they can all be occupied in making of breads is by making a conveyor belt, making a system, which is Achas Lasha. A woman is kneading, and another woman then is going to be shaping, and a third woman then is going to be baking, with more details in the Gemara. In other words, they cannot knead at the same time. It has to be done in a way where each one, the loaves of each one is constantly going to be worked with. And Rabbi Akiva is challenging Rabbi Gamliel. How can you give a klal that 3 women can do all together? I don't understand. Maybe you're right. If the oven is very hot and the challahs are being baked quicker. Maybe you're right if these women are more professional and they work quicker, they work slower. There's the sizes of the oven. There's so many details that makes it into a variable. How can you give across the board rule? If it's not more than 3 women, we're good. That's a big kasha. And the way the Gemara is going to learn that this last line in the Mishnah is Rabbi Gamliel's response, to which Rabbi Gamliel responds, I don't have such a problem. I have a L'Moshe Mishnah, 3 women. If it's only 3 women, they can all bake together. You're right. Sometimes they're making larger loaves. Sometimes the oven is working slower, but there is another precaution that circumvents, that takes away the problem. And that is the woman who's not getting to put her loaves in the oven immediately, she should look at her loaves. The moment tafach, the moment it becomes gaivadik, the moment it begins to swell up, tiltosh b'tzoinam, the woman will moisten her hands with cold water and smear the water on the dough, as we had on Daf Mem Vav in the bottom. Ben Beseda spoke about putting it in cold water. Here we're not putting it in cold water because it's going to be going into the oven soon. But that eitzah of putting cold on the doughs, stopping the beginning of the chimutz process, that resolves your kasha that like nashim shavais, or like eitzim shavais, or like terun shavais pseided. I have an antidote, and that's enough. And that's the klal. 4 women, 4 women. Sometimes if the oven is working quicker, I know that, but there's a rule: 3 and not 4. It might become chametzik. You have to take a look at it. That's the response of Rabbi Gamliel to Rabbi Akiva. Guys, we spoke out the whole Gemara by heart. Now let's read it inside. Tana Rabbanan, that this is the shita of Rabbi Gamliel. What's pshat? That they take turns. That lasha he mikatefes gavaldik. That the first one of the 3 that needs the first, she goes straight from kneading. What happens after kneading? Shaping. And while this first woman is shaping, then the chaver to lasha tachtel. Not like Rabbi Gamliel. No, wait. When the first woman is shaping, now the first woman begins to knead. Now, mikatefes, hiyoifer. Let's go back to this first woman who finished shaping. When she finished shaping, she's going to put her breads straight into the oven. Now that she's putting it into the oven, the chaverta, woman number 2, who already kneaded, now mikatefes tachtel, she begins to shape. So still the dough is being worked with, and only now will the third one begin to knead. Vashlisha slafa. Now, what happens if the first woman and the second and the third, they want to bake more than only one batch? Say that, so they can keep on going on the system. So now woman number 1 wants to do more. Oifa, hilasha, the one that already baked. While woman number 3 finished kneading, when woman number 3 is beginning to shape, now woman number 1 can go back and start kneading. And v'chaver to oifer tachteav ashlishis mekatefes, and that's chayzeres chalila. Chalila miloshin machal. Machal means a circle, a dance. So that's the circle. Make sure that the dough is never sitting. Calls mantra sekas bebatzek because of this rule. As long as you're manipulating the dough, ain't about the chimutz. And on that, Rabbi Kiva has a gewaldige challenge. Rabbi Kiva tells Rabbi Gamliel, like Alanoshim, what like Alanoshim Shabbos. Kanya Amar Rabbi Kiva. I want you to know, Rabbi Kiva argued to Rabbi Gamliel. Danti lefnei Rabbi Gamliel. I challenged him directly. Yilmidenu Rabbeinu. I don't understand. When you say 3 women can eat at the same time, even though the oven is only large enough for the bread of 1. What about, are you speaking about nashim that are zerizois, that I get, or nashim she'enam zerizois? Are you speaking about eitzim lachim or eitzim that are yavesh? Are you speaking about tanur cham or tanur tzoinen? In andere Werte, how can you give such a general rule when there's so many variables? So now we chap how to learn pshat in the Mishnah. So Amar li, so Rabbi Gamliel responded, Ein lecha elo ma sheshanu chachamim. My friends, Torah is a Masoira. Rabbi Gamliel says, this is the way I was taught. 3 women can do it, not 4, but 3. There's many variables. There's a solution that the chachamim taught, that if indeed Zajac tafach, the moment one of the women noticed, because maybe there was a slowing of the conveyor belt, someone here was a kratzen, was not a zoros, and the oven was cold, and the eitzim were lachim, and a chanami. You have to look at the doughs, and the moment you see that it's beginning to swell, then tiltoish b'tzoinen, then you have to moisten your hands with cold water and put that water on the doughs, and that will stop it from becoming chametz dik. And now, Chevra, we're going to learn the last Mishnah of today.
That is Rabbi Gamliel responding. Is that?
Yes. Beautiful, huh? So now when you look at the Mishnah, you see how you can't learn the Mishnah without learning this. Because in the Mishnah, you don't even see it's a response. In the Mishnah, it looks like, but it doesn't make sense. That's the response of Rabbi Gamliel. Says the final Mishnah. So let's just chazir this again. What's shiur? Shiur means dough that's beginning to become chametz, but it's not fully chametzdik. What does that mean? So here are the 3 steps. Step number 1 is after you make the dough and it's sitting for that amount of time, whether it's 18 minutes or whatever it is, then it begins to become pale. The external part, the periphery, the outside part of the dough becomes pale. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is that little cracks begin to form on the outside of the dough. Kekarnei chagavim. Step number 3 is those cracks grow and they begin to interlace. Let's repeat it by heart. Rab Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rab Meir, when the outside becomes pale, thus is shiur. Shiur is taka not chiyuv kares, but with Rab Meir, shiur is alav. That's chametz nuksha. That's the beginning of our mesechta, beginning of our pedic. Shitas Rab Meir. Rabbi Yehuda first of all holds that if the external is pale, it's not even shiur yet. It's matzah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, only the next step makes it shiur, begins to crack. According to Rav Meir, when it begins to crack, it's bona fide chametz. According to Rabbi Yehuda, when it begins to crack, it's only shiur. On top of that, Rabbi Yehuda holds shiur is not even chayiv malchus. When the cracks interlace, that's even Rabbi Yehuda, that's chametz gomer. So let's read the Mishnah inside. Also happens to be that our Mishnah doesn't quote Rabbi Meir, it quotes the Chachamim, but we'll see that was the shita that came from Rabbi Meir. Says the Mishnah, shiur. When you have shiur, yisarif. However, abir, don't think you have to burn it, because if you eat it, you're going to be getting a punishment on the biblical level. If you eat shiur, you are pater. You know what pater means? Not only are you pater from kares, but you are even pater from malchus. Beautiful. This is in contrast to the first Mishnah, Elo Ivren, that the Mishnah Dir wrote that for chametz nuksha you are going to be chayiv malchus. This Tanakama, which is Rabbi Yehuda, holds you're not chayiv malchus, but you still should burn it. But you're not chayiv malchus. Now siduk, once it has cracks, then cracks means it's not just kekarni chagavim. Once it's fully interlaced, now not only do you have to burn it, but this is bona fide chametz. The ha'oich lechayiv kares. Ezeu shiur. What is shiur, guys? Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rav Meir, shiur happens earlier. Happens when it becomes pale. According to Rabbi Yehuda, pale is not even shiur. Shiur is at least when it's kekarnei chagav. According to Rav Meir, that's chametz gomer. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's shiur. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, for shiur, you should burn it, but you're not even chayv malchus. Siduk means, cracks or furrows mean, that shenis arvu sadak and zebozeh, that these little cracks that have the length and the width of the antennas of locust, that they already grow, and one goes into the other. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. However, and we'll see again, Chachamim, which accepted Shitos of Rabbi Meir, that the two cases that you gave, both kekarnei chagavim and for sure with siduk, then that's not even called shiur. That's chametz gomer. What is shiur? Shiur is the first step, which is kol she'chsifu panav, that the outside of the dough became pale, like a person's face, that when he's filled with fright, so you feel you're fright by your hair standing up. At that moment, you look pale. That type of paleness. And another detail that the Mishnah doesn't write over here, but we have to put together the first Mishnah in the Perek, that according to Rav Meir, not only does he hold that shiur starts earlier, but shiur is a case, not the only case, of chametz nuksha. Rav Meir holds that for chametz nuksha, you're going to be chayiv on a lava as well. Says the Gemara, Tanach Rabbanan. More details. Izeu shiur. What is shiur? So this is the first sheet in the Braisa, says Rabbi Meir. Kol shechsifu panav ka'adam she'amadoi sa'aroisov. That's step number one. That's shiur. Step number two, which is siduk kekarnei chagavim. That's siduk. In other words, Rav Meir does not differentiate between whether it is kekarnei chagavim, whether it interlaces, because according to Rabbi Meir, the moment it's cracked, it's already chametz gomer. That's the words of Rabbi Meir. We clearly like the Chachamim in our Mishnah. However, the Chachamim Moimrim, don't get confused. The Chachamim in the Braisa, that's Rabbi Yehuda. Ezeu shiur. Now, the first step of it becoming pale, kol shechsifu panav, is garnished. It's matzah, no problem. What is shiur? Only when step number two happens. Kekarnei chagavim. What is siduk? Shenis arvu sadakam zebozeh. Now here in the Braisa it says that v'zeh ha'oichloi chayiv kadis. That has to be explained. Guys, right there, Braisa is ending. We're ending with the words of the Chachamim in the Braisa, which is Rabbi Yehuda. No, not true, because we correctly said, first of all, step number one to Rabbi Yehuda is nothing. It's not even shiur. Step number two is kekarnei chagavim. Rabbi Yehuda holds that not only are you not chayiv kadis, you're not even chayiv malchus. So what does it mean? Shiur yisarif. The Tanach of our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda, that's the Chachamim. But v'ha'oichlei pater divid Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, says the Gemara, the end of the Braisa is Rav Meir. The end of the Braisa is Rav Meir. The Emel Rav Meir, zeh v'zeh ha'oichlei chayiv kadis. Beautiful. No, it's two things. Number one, Rav Meir holds that even for what Rav Meir calls shiur, you're chayiv malchus, but you're not chayiv kadis. But according to Rav Meir, shiur is just the first step, is already the first step. The moment it's cracked, even kekarnei chagavim, let Rav Meir, it's chametz gomer. For chametz gomer, you chayiv kadis. So zeh, whether it's only kekarnei chagavim, or whether the siduk, the cracking interlaced, zeh chayiv kadis. Beautiful. And Amar Rava, my comment Rav Meir is more machmir. We're not speaking about the punishment. Rav Meir doesn't differentiate whether the cracks are little or whether the cracks are big. Once it's pale, and any amount of cracking, even only kekarnei chagavim, it's chametz gomer. Farvas. So he says, ein locha kol sedek v'sedek mil ma'ilom, she'ein lo kama sadakim mil mata. How beautiful is that? In other words, you only see the chetzonius. When there's a little crack in the top, it's tak a little. And theoretically, for little cracks, it's not chametz gomer. But the only way there are little cracks on top is because there are many cracks underneath it. What a great Musar Haskell. When you see a person, most people that are a little bit cracking up, in other words, they have a tzara, most people hold it in. Some people, when they shriel out, maybe there's a little bit of tzaras. But most people, once you see some issue, you can assume that there's a lot more than what you're seeing. And they need a lot more help than they're ashamed to ask. Because kol sedek v'sedek mil ma'ila has many sedakim mil mata, so it's fully cracked in there. And it's interlaced. And therefore, Rav Meir holds that it is chametz gomer. Gevaldik. Guys, tomorrow we are learning Mamish Tafshin Pei Aleph. something rare. Tomorrow's daf begins with Shabbos being Erev Pesach and all of the unique dinim that come into play because it is Shabbos itself. Shabbos is Erev Pesach, God willing, to be continued. It's practical. It's
so when the cracks are interlaced, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's kares.
Correct,
right?
That's bona fide.
And according to him, just the cracks that are not interlaced, that's called shiur, and then for that you get nothing.
Oh, 1 second. Two things. You don't get penalized. Correct. It's shiur,
Malchus.
but you don't get any penalty. You don't even get malchus. Which is not malchus.
I get.
Have a gewaldige day.